Luke 15, verse 11. Jesus continued, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger one said to his father, 'Father, give me my share of the estate.' So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who set him to his field to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, 'How many of my father's hired servants have food to spare, and I'm here starving to death? I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants.' So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his servants, 'Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found.' So they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, the elder son was in the field. He came near the house. He heard the music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. 'Your brother has come,' he replied, 'and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound.' The elder brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, 'Look, all these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours who has squandered your property with prostitutes comes home, you kill the fattened calf for him?' 'My son,' the father said, 'you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad, because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and he is found.'"
Thank you very much. Well, keep a finger in that, because we're going to be... Hey, look at this. Everything's falling apart. Yes, so strong I am. Now, we'll be thinking about this story. This is probably the most famous story ever told by the most famous storyteller in the world. Okay? This is often known as the story of the prodigal son, and it's absolute dynamite. Do not underestimate what this story can do in your life tonight. When this story is told, the bomb goes off. When this story is told, asteroids crash down into your life. When this story is told, there is new life and new hope. This is a really subversive story and a really profound story. And so I'm just going to ask for some help from God to help me be clear and to help all of us to understand what God has written for us here in His Word. So let me pray that I'd be clear and that we would hear what these words really mean. Let's pray. Dear Father, I pray that whoever we are, whether we've ever read from the Bible before in our lives or not, whether we've ever set foot inside a church before or not, that you would speak to us. Would you speak to each one of us? Speak to me. Would you make yourself very real to us? Would you show us Jesus again? So that as we look to Him, we might know who we truly are and who you truly are. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Well, this story is dynamite. It really is. This came home to me a few years ago in Eastbourne, where I live, and within 24 hours, I spoke on this story in two very different locations, and it had two very different reactions. So the first time I spoke on this passage, I was going into a nursing home. As I said, I'm a Church of England minister, so I was in my gear with the dog collar going into a very well-to-do nursing home in Eastbourne, and it's the sort of place where everybody comes up to you and says, "Do you know how old I am?" And I say, 26. And they say, 107. And it's the sort of place where all the women call me father, which is kind of disturbing given the age difference. And all the men generally call me padre, which actually I quite like. I quite like being called padre. But I would go in, I would take a little communion service. And a few years ago, I just read this story that Pete just read. A story about a son who runs away, realizes what he's missing back at home, comes home and gets the most extraordinary and extravagant welcome. I just read this story out. Literally, I said very few words that day. And somehow, a girl had found her way into this tiny little communion service in a chapel. She was about 19, 20 years old, German. I don't know why she's here. To this day, I don't know why she's here. She was not on staff there. I'm not sure who she was visiting because she was not sitting with anybody else. But she had found her way into the back of this chapel. She heard this story and she was uncontrollably weeping. Uncontrollably weeping to hear about the welcome that there might be from the ultimate Father. Here is a girl far from home, and she hears this story, and it feels like home. The next day, I spoke on this same passage at my home church. I go to a church called All Souls Eastbourne in the middle of Eastbourne, and one of the things we do over the summer is we have lunchtime concerts, and people come in and they do their music. There are very mixed abilities of those who come and sing, and this particular Wednesday lunchtime, it was the works of Gilbert and Sullivan, and there was like a 70-year-old soprano warbling, and it was cacophonous, absolutely cacophonous. But there was a small crowd who gathered to hear her, and during the interval, the young curate, that's the vicar with his L plates on, that was me, gets to come up and share a few blessed thoughts, okay? And so once again, I just read that story that you just heard from Pete. And I draw out one of the implications of this story. I ask them this question: who is easier to get into heaven? A good person or a bad person? Who is easier to get into heaven? A good person or a bad person? And then I give the obvious answer from this story. The obvious answer is a bad person, obviously. If you're paying attention to the story, you get that straight away. It's far easier to get a bad person into heaven than a good person. Far easier. That's what this story is all about. We'll get into that. And I was just saying, obviously, what the most famous story ever told by the most famous storyteller in the world says. Because what have you got? You've got this family, you've got a goodie and a baddie, don't you? The older brother, the younger brother. The younger brother really is a baddie. He's a wrong 'un. He really is. And yet, at the end of the story, he is invited into the feast that throughout Luke's gospel represents heaven. And the older brother, the good boy, is outside, refusing to come in with weeping and wailing and the angry gnashing of teeth. So, who's easier to get into heaven? A goodie or a baddie? It's absolutely obvious, isn't it, from this story? Much easier to get a bad person into heaven than a good person. Now, how do you think my words were going over in respectable Eastbourne? Don't know if you know anything about Eastbourne. It's kind of known to be like the retirement capital of the UK. It's the sort of place where all the shop front windows are bifocal, just to help out, you know. And here are some very respectable people in their twin set and pearls listening to, I think it was meant to be Gilbert and Sullivan, right? In a church building, a clergyman gets up and the bomb goes off. And there was a woman in the congregation right around over here, and she said to her neighbor, but really she was saying it to the whole church, in a loud voice, She just said, "Well, I suppose we should all just be bad then." Just echoed round the church. It stopped the talk. What did I say? I'll tell you what I said in a second. But that is the bomb that goes off whenever this story is thought about. It's not just some blessed words. It is either tears of grateful joy from a girl far from home, or it's angry heckling. Who gets heckled at a lunchtime concert in Eastbourne? I do. That's who. Because all I'm doing is drawing out the implications of this story. This story is absolute dynamite, and it always has a response. And it always has one of these two responses, either tears of grateful joy or the angry heckling. And you'll see that if you actually have a look at page 42. The place where this story begins, do you see the big number 15? That means it's chapter 15 within Luke's Gospel, this biography of Jesus. The heading says the parable of the lost sheep. And right next to chapter 15 there, you'll see who Jesus is speaking to. It says, "Now the tax collectors and sinners were all gathering around to hear Jesus, but the Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, 'This man welcomes sinners and eats with them.'" There's two kinds of people listening to Jesus. On the one hand, what have you got? Tax collectors and sinners. Now, tax collectors, they are collaborators with the hated Roman Empire. Okay? Imagine if you're in Ukraine right now, and you are a Ukrainian, but you're in cahoots with the Russian invaders, right? And you're taking money from your own people in order to support the Russian war effort. How popular would you be in Ukraine, right? That's what the tax collectors were doing. They were Jewish people, but they took money from their own people to give it to the hated Romans, okay? They were wrong-uns, okay? The tax collectors and sinners. Here are people who don't mind going off the rails. They've got the t-shirt that says, "I'm a sinner and I don't care who knows it," okay? So let's say that this half of the room, okay? With all due respect, you are sinners tonight, okay? You guys are sinners. But down this dividing line, on the other side of the room, we've got these other people. Do you see in verse 2? "But the Pharisees and teachers of the law were muttering." So Pharisees were religious elites, teachers of the law, Bible teachers, okay? Here is the religious establishment. And you're very different to these people, aren't you? You're not sinners. You would hate to be known as a sinner, okay? You, with all due respect, are slaves, okay? You are respectable people who always play by the rules. And if you go for respect, you guys go for experience, right? You guys are all about breaking off the shackles, getting with the wind in your hair, going off and exploring life. Okay? You want to experience life in all its grandeur. You guys, you want to earn and scrimp and save and play by the book, don't you? That's what the slaves are like. That's what the sinners are like. I often think about the difference between Eastbourne and Brighton. So, Brighton is the next town along on the south coast. And what's fascinating about Brighton is it's so bohemian, it's so, liberated, and it's got the country's only Green MP, right? And even its name describes what you should do in Brighton. Be right on, you know? That's what you should, be right on, okay, in Brighton. And Brighton is just full of boutique cafes where everyone's reading The Guardian. In Eastbourne, tea shops and the Daily Mail. Okay, and the world is kind of like that. The world and human temperaments tend to lean one way or the other. I don't know which way you are. I won't get you to get up and sort of swap sides, but maybe right now you're thinking, I actually quite like the rules. Because with the rules, you know where you stand, right? There'll be a lot of people in here, they'll be like that. I like the rules, because I know where I stand with the rules. And a lot of you are like, I hate the rules. Just get the rules off me. I want to break free, baby, right? Which way do you land? Well, what's fascinating about this story is that Jesus is like, some people, they lean a little bit slave side, and some people, they lean a little bit sinner side, but Jesus is different. And he's not half of one and half of the other. He's this totally different way of being a human. You know, the whole world either leans left or leans right. There's the West and there's the East. But then there's one from above. And Jesus comes to planet Earth and he's totally different. He lives the pure life of love which the law of God demands. You know, the Old Testament, full of 613 commandments. They're all about love God, love neighbor. Jesus comes to planet Earth and he fulfills all those laws. He's totally loving God, totally loving neighbor. So you think, oh, is he like the slaves? But then at the same time, he's utterly liberated. He just walks around planet Earth like he owns the place. And he'll break all the silly, fastidious rules that the religious leaders have. And you think, well, is he like a sinner? No. Is he like a slave? No, he's different. He's the Son of God. But the fascinating thing is when he comes to planet Earth, who is it that finds themselves attracted to Jesus? Is it the sinners or is it the slaves? Who finds themselves attracted to Jesus most naturally? Well, there it is in verse 2. The Pharisees and the teachers of the law muttered, "This man welcomes sinners and eats with them." They hate that. So, the Son of God comes to earth, and the rule breakers love him, and the rule makers mutter. That's interesting, isn't it? Can you start to see why this story is dynamite? It's not what you thought, is it? It's not like a stained glass window picture, is it? It's not just a religious story to keep you moral. This is really going to make you think tonight. Jesus is telling a story about, which one are you guys? You guys are the sinners, aren't you? Yeah, I could tell. You guys are the sinners. You guys are the slaves. And then Jesus tells a story. In fact, he tells 3 stories. On Monday night, we had a look at the first 2 of the stories. You'll see the headings. The parable of the lost coin was the first story. The parable of the lost sheep is the first story. And then the parable of the lost coin is the second story. And then without a break, he goes for this third story, the parable of the lost son. That's what Pete read to us. And so verse 11, look, Jesus continued, there was a man who had 2 sons. There's a baddie and a goodie. So, the younger son, the tearaway who runs away from home, who does he represent? Who does he represent? Sinners. He's your spokesperson. Okay. And then there's an older son who's very fastidious, who stays at home, never breaks the rules. Who does he represent? The slaves. But then there is a father. And who does the father represent? Who does the father represent? Yeah, we're pointing up. Yeah. And specifically, we're pointing up to Jesus, actually. Remember, here is Jesus. There is Jesus. He's got sinners and slaves in front of him. And he says, let me tell you what's going on. There was once a father who had a bad son and a good son. Right? So we know who the bad son is. That's the sinners and tax collectors. We know who the good son is. That's the Pharisees, the teachers of the law. Who does the father represent? Jesus. Jesus. I mean, Jesus is not a father, biologically, but neither is he a shepherd, nor is he a mother. But he's just told a story about a shepherd. He's just told a story about a mother. Now he's telling a story about a father. Doesn't mean he's a shepherd. Doesn't mean he's a mother. Doesn't mean he's a biological dad. But this is him, because he tells a story about welcoming a sinner and eating with him. And the slaves, the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, they mutter, right? This is a story about the love of Jesus, this story. Is that news to you? This story is about the love of Jesus inviting the world to come home to his love, his family love. But what happens? Verse 12, the younger one, the tearaway, he said to his father, "Father, give me my share of the estate." This is a shocking thing to do to a dad. It's like, "Dear Dad, you know all that money that's coming to me when you die? You seem to be taking your time. How is your health, by the way?" it's getting so that I quite like your stuff. So either could you hurry up and die, or if not, why don't you give me the money that's coming to me so that I can get as far away from you as I possibly can. Love your son. So easy to look at the prodigal son. Have you heard the phrase the prodigal son before? That's the name that people have given to this younger son. So easy to think of this prodigal son as he's a bit of a rough diamond. Bit of a tearaway, bit of a rapscallion. No. This kid, you don't treat your dad like this. Especially if your dad is like this dad. It's actually quite shocking. He's saying, I wish you were dead. I want your things, but I don't want you. And actually, that's what I said to the woman in Eastbourne. Do you remember the lunchtime concert? Remember me getting heckled? And there she was saying, I suppose we should all just become bad then. If only bad people get to heaven, I suppose we should all just become bad then. What did I say back to her? I said, you don't need to become bad, do you? Because haven't we all done what the prodigal son does, right? Haven't we all, on one level or another, haven't we all said, God, I quite like your stuff. I'm not really sure I want a relationship. I quite like to have all your things. I don't really want you. No, we do. I do that all the time. At my best, I'm grateful for the gifts that God gives in this world. But do I really want to address my thanks to the giver? Do I really want to know the giver? So many of us. It's the natural bent of the human heart, isn't it? To take God's gifts and ignore the giver. We're all a bit like this, aren't we? No one is entirely slave and no one is entirely sinner. We're all a mix of both. But we all do this, which means we don't have to become bad, do we? There's badness in all of us, if only we'd search our own hearts. So, the father, he says, Father, give me my share of the estate. Fascinatingly, the father, in verse 12, divided his property between them. I mean, this is what makes you see. This is not a parenting manual, okay? Jesus is telling a spiritual story about spiritual truths, because what dad does this? What dad actually says, all right, son, I'll liquidate all my assets and I'll divide the whole wealth between you and your brother. What kind of father is this? Here's a father who will give even to sinners what they want. And if sinners really, really want things, he'll say, okay, have it. Have it. He'll hand them over to their selfish desires. It's a strange thing to do, but it makes sense when you get to the end of the story. Verse 13, not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. We're not told what he spent all his money on. You'll notice, remember the older brother? He said to his dad later, he's spent it all on prostitutes. We have no way of knowing how the older brother would have known that, right? It's an interesting insight into the older brother's psychology. I bet he's over there spending it on prostitutes. We don't know that. All it says is wild living. He lived expensively. Okay? He got the £1 million. If you were here last night, we asked the question, what would you do if you got £1 million? He would spend it. Squandered it. And after he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in that whole country. And he began to be in need. There's always a famine. The money always runs out. You know, for the last 75 years, we've pretty much in the West considered ourselves to be beyond biblical times, haven't we? Because we've lived in the post-war West, haven't we? We're beyond warfare these days, aren't we? And you know, in the Bible, it keeps on talking about pestilence and plague. We're beyond that, aren't we? And the Bible talks about famine. We're beyond famine, aren't we? Well, in the last few years, things have really snapped back on us, haven't they? And we've come to see that we are not beyond biblical times at all. We live in a world full of war and pestilence. And here comes the famine. What makes life hard? Life is very hard. We saw that on the video, didn't we? Things like bereavement, things like warfare, fuel costs, how am I going to pay my bills, family issues. The money always runs out. The famine always hits. We have run away from a God who is full of generosity and life, but when you run away from life, you run into death. You just kind of do. We live in a world that is so broken, and all the money in the world can't fix that. So here is this boy. He spent everything. There's a severe famine in the whole country. He began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. This boy has descended quite some distance. This Jewish boy is now feeding pigs. What would the family think? He has sunk to new depths. And then in verse 17, it's interesting. He comes to his senses. Or you could translate that. He came to himself. He woke up to himself. He started to figure out what was going on. I don't think this is the turning point of the story. Because when he came to his senses, he said, hang on, how many of my father's hired servants have food to spare? And here I am starving to death. I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. I don't think this is the turning point of the story. Sometimes people read the story and they think, when you're at your lowest, you've just got to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, figure stuff out, and turn your life around, right? Not really. I don't think that's the moral to this story. For a start, what does he really want from his dad at this point? He wants a bed and a shower and a hot meal. And he basically wants to become a servant. He wants to become a slave, actually. And when it comes to earthly change, quite often, sinner-type people end up pulling their lives together and becoming slaves. And quite often, slave-type people, they get tired of the slaving and they go and do a bit of sinning for a bit, right? That's what human behavior is like. But that's not what Jesus wants. Jesus doesn't want us just crossing the room horizontally like that. And he actually, the sorry spiel that he kind of dreams up in his head, it's actually echoing some words that were said in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, the part of the Bible written before Jesus came as a human being. There was somebody very famously who said, I have sinned before heaven and before you. I'm sorry. But the person who said that was Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, the arch baddie in the whole Exodus story. And Jesus puts those words onto this boy's lips. I don't think this is true sorrow. I think he's basically got a pigsty plan to get a bed for the night. He doesn't save himself. He doesn't pull himself together. He's not the rescuer of him. Who is? I love it. Verse 20. So he got up and went to his father, but while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and, how would you finish that sentence? I mean, think of the typical Australian parent. If you were going to do a movie about this, you might have a homestead, and there's a typical Australian dad polishing his shotgun on the veranda. The sinful boy draws up in his ute. Really, I think what would happen in that scenario, the father would just say, you keep on driving, son. You just keep straight on driving, right? In any traditional culture, this father would have probably already held a funeral for his wicked son. He would have said, you're dead to me. How dare you drag our family through this? How dare you descend to the pigs? How dare you make me liquidate all my assets just because you wanted me dead? No, son. You should have died in that far country. That's what you would expect from any traditional father, and yet this father is out of this world. While the boy was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. You know, the number one word that is used to describe the emotional life of Jesus in the Bible, you know what it is? It's this word right here, compassion. It's a word that means he's turned in his stomach with pity. It's gut-wrenching love he has for his son. It's a word that's so strong, it's never applied to anyone else in the rest of the Bible. No one else has compassion the way Jesus has compassion. And this man is a beautiful representative of the compassion of Jesus. When he saw him, he was filled with this gut-wrenching pity for his son. In the pit of his stomach, he felt the love. He ran to his son. Now think about that. I mean, think about women in the room. Okay, if you're wearing a dress that goes all the way down to your ankles, you know what you need to do in order to run. This man would have been there in his long flowing robes. First century patriarch. His robes would have reached down to his ankles. If he's going to run, what's he going to have to do? What'll he have to do? Have to hitch up his robes, won't he? It looks ridiculous for me to do it, doesn't it? And I tell you, it's not the sort of thing that a first century patriarch did. I'll tell you that much. Men never ran. Ever. Children might run. Women in an emergency might run. A man in his position would never. It was shameful. You hitch up your robes, you bare your legs. He doesn't care. This father, filled with gut-wrenching pity, he runs and he smothers this boy and hugs and kisses. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him and kissed him. He looks very motherly, doesn't he? He's a very motherly father, filled with compassion, filled with joy. He's got his boy back. Don't you love this? And if you're a 19-year-old German girl far away and you hear this story, you start crying at this point. I don't know what her story was. I don't know why she was crying that morning when I did that little communion service. But there's something that connects with the human heart. No matter how far you have run, no matter what you have done, no matter what, you have not sinned yourself out of the love of Jesus. His arms are wide open for you. They were nailed open for you. He lives, he died, he rose again to embrace you, to bring you into the family love that you are made for. Doesn't matter what you've done. It doesn't matter how far you've run. It does not matter. You are welcome with the love of Jesus. It's beautiful. The son said to him, he tries to get his little sorry spiel out. Father, I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father cuts him off. Do you remember the speech he was going to make? He was going to say, wasn't he? What was he going to say? I am no longer worthy to be called your son. How was he going to finish the sorry spiel? Make me like one of your hired men. He was going to say, Father, make me a slave. I've been a sinner. Please make me a slave. Does the father let him do that? No. You must understand this. Christianity is not about making you a slave. It is absolutely not that. It is not about saying to disobedient people, now, could you try to behave a little better, please? It's absolutely not that. It's got nothing to do with that. It's not about this journey from sinner to slave or slave to sinner. God does not want to make you a slave. He wants you home as a son or a daughter. He wants you wrapped in the arms of Jesus, on a love that predated and produced the universe. That's what he wants. He doesn't want slaves. Cuts him off. The father said to his servants, verse 22, quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. He's not just a servant. And he's not just back to being the younger brother again. He's honored. He's welcomed. He's celebrated. at the heart of this feast that is a picture of heaven. It's beautiful, isn't it? They began to celebrate. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. So they began to celebrate. This is why Jesus came. He came to call anyone. You could be a Ukrainian collaborator with the Russians, and Jesus would call you home. And if you turned to him, he would have you. If you want to join the joy, you can. The arms are opened for you. But the story is only half done at this stage, isn't it? So often we call this story the story of the prodigal son. There's a problem with that. There are two sons. Even here, the heading that's been given in this little translation of the Bible, the parable of the lost son, well, there are two sons. And there's a father. It's not just about the lost son. What's going to happen with the other boy? Well, this is dynamite. Verse 25, meanwhile, the elder son was in the field. That's the natural habitat for the elder son, okay? The natural habitat for the younger boy is the far country. The natural habitat for the elder son is the field. You can imagine him, can't you? There he is, like sunburnt from a hard day's work, sweat on his brow, shovel in hand. There he is in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. I'm not sure he's a big fan of music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. Isn't that fascinating? He doesn't go to the father, what's going on. He goes to a servant, and the servant knows what's going on with the father more than the elder brother does. It's the first hint that we have that the elder brother's relationship with his father is not what it should be. So he asks the servant, what's going on? Verse 27, your brother has come, he replied, and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound. The elder brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. I love this father. He's not playing favorites. It's not that he kind of likes the rapscallion boy, but he's not so much into the obedient son. It's not that. He loves both sons. He goes out to the sinner, and he goes out to the slave. His father went out and pleaded with him. But the elder brother answered his father, look, Dad. Not even Dad, just look. It's incredibly rude language, actually. I mean, first century sons did not speak to their fathers like this, but this boy has become furious. He's going nuclear. All these years I've been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. How does he consider himself? Does he consider himself as a beloved son? Or does he consider himself as a good slave? His whole sense of identity is about climbing the ladder, getting respect, earning it. All these years I've been slaving for you and I've never disobeyed your orders. Really? Never? Really? But that's his sense of identity. That's his sense of self. He cannot admit to being a sinner. He cannot admit to being wrong. His whole identity is about being right. How could he claim that he's wrong? He refuses to admit that he's wrong. I've never disobeyed your orders, yet you never gave me even a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. Well, there's no evidence that he ever asked his father for a young goat. And given what we know about this father, do you think the father would be stingy about giving a young goat? But he's not the asking type. And he's not the celebrating type. He would far rather scrimp and save and earn. That is his whole existence. But when this son of yours who has squandered your property with prostitutes comes home, again, how do we know this? It's all in his head. You kill the fattened calf for him. And then the father's got these two beautiful words that just prick the bubble of the elder brother. My son. Isn't that beautiful? My son. My son. You're not a slave. Slaves aren't sons. And sons don't slave. Don't tell me you're a slave. You are my boy. You are my beloved. You are my son. You are always with me, and everything I have is yours. You know, that's technically true. Because remember back in verse 12, the father divided the inheritance between them. You notice that in verse 12? The father gave the inheritance to both boys. See, the older son has had money on tap the whole time. If he wants to spend it, if he wants to use it to celebrate, if he wants to use it to have a party with his father. No, he doesn't want to have a party with his father, but he wants to have a hypothetical party with his friends, with a young goat. But all that the father has is on tap for this boy. It's all been for the asking. Yet he has not treated his father as a generous father. He's treated him as a slave driver who dishes out his blessings with a teaspoon and a scowl. But the father's like, no, my son, you are always with me and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. Will you come home? Will you join the joy? And the story ends. Cliffhanger. Right? You thought that EastEnders invented the cliffhanger? No, 2,000 years earlier. Cliffhanger. Does the boy come in? What do you reckon? Does the elder brother come in? Does he come home? I don't know what you think about it. But if the elder brother represents the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, how did they respond to Jesus? Did they come home to the love of Jesus? By and large, they didn't. By and large, they sold him for dead. So for me, if there was a verse 33, there isn't a verse 33, but in my translation, if there was a verse 33, the elder brother would fly into a rage, pick up his shovel, and bash his old man to death. Because that's what the Pharisees and the teachers of the law did to Jesus. You know, it wasn't the mob that killed Jesus so much as the moralists. Dynamite, right? Isn't this story dynamite? What's it about? It's about the natural bent of the human heart. Some of us naturally go for experiences, but the experiences run out and we end up in the pigsty. But then we also want to go for respect. We want to earn it, right? And we end up proud and angry. What's the solution? The solution is to give up on the sinner thing, give up on the slave thing, come home to the love of the Son. His arms are wide open to both. And he says to you, look, if you identify more as the sinner, it doesn't matter how deep you've gotten lost in that pigsty. It does not matter. Come home and join the joy. And he says to those who've gotten an identity by being good religious people, right? The slaves. He says to them, it doesn't matter what you've done in the field. It doesn't matter about your religious service. It doesn't matter about your moral record. There is a God with arms wide open who is urging you to join the joy. Don't stay aloof from him. Don't stay aloof from him because you fear your badness. Don't stay aloof from him because you claim your goodness. Just come home. Come home to the love of Jesus. I'm going to offer a prayer right now, and it's a prayer you can pray however you identify. Look, on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, I'm more sinner. On Tuesdays, Thursdays, and the weekend, I'm more slave. All of us are a mixed bag. But Jesus comes home. Jesus comes to planet Earth to invite us home. And I just want to offer a few words that you can pray, and you can just say, Jesus, I'm coming home. I want to know your feasting joy forever. It's the best decision you could ever make. Let's bow our heads and let me pray for us. And if you like, you can echo these words in your own heart. The words are not magic. You can make them your own. But here are the sort of things you might want to say to Jesus. Dear Jesus, I'm sorry for the ways that I sin, and I'm sorry for the ways that I slave. Thank you that your arms are open to me. Thank you they were nailed open for me on the cross. Thank you that you've risen up again to invite me home. Jesus, I want to know you. Please help me to forget my badness and my goodness, but to know your love. Fill me with your Spirit and walk with me through this life and into your eternal feast. Amen.